Dr. Barnett.
Well, thank you. Before I get the PowerPoint going, let me just say how much I've enjoyed teaching this series and enjoyed your contributions and discussions. And it's hard to do it virtually, but I think it's worked out pretty well. And I'm very appreciative of the invitation to join you this year and of the time we've had together. So I always feel like I should allow a lot more time for questions, but I think since today's the last Sunday, what I'm going to suggest is if you have specific questions based on anything I've said in the past weeks or today, if you want to type those into the chat, and then at the end of our session, I hope we'll have a little bit of time where I can both take questions and observations from the breakout rooms and answer any longer term questions that have been kind of building. So I'm going to switch to the PowerPoint today, and I hope you can see it. Let's see, current slide. So just as an overview of where we've been and where we are today, we've been discussing what Christian formation means generally and what it meant for Bonhoeffer and in what ways his insights resonate with us today, specifically those years that he was teaching seminarians in the Confessing Church from 1935 to 1939. His writings during that time on discipleship and life together, on the nature of Christian formation and the nature of discipleship and community. Last week, I gave an overview of the challenges that began to really confront Bonhoeffer as well as the seminarians after 1939. And today I want to draw some connections between all that and what we could possibly take from that experience today. So it's a lot to go through, but let me start with sort of an overview and then talk specifically both about his late writings and the challenging aspects of those writings and the ways in which I think they really do come out of this period in which his focus is Christian community and formation. So we've looked at the specific historical context of what he was doing. And of course, it's a very specific context. He's in Nazi Germany. He's in a dictatorship. He's in a church in which there is a significant faction that wants to Nazify the church, and he's a member of the opposition to that. And then between 1935 and 39, he begins to teach seminaries in that context. So he's not just teaching Christian formation, he's teaching Christian formation in a very specific context that he knows, in which he knows that they will face significant challenges once they enter the ministry, that their ministry to the church will be very different in the context of Nazi Germany. And then of course, after 1939, when this period comes to an end, the war begins and Bonhoeffer is drawn into the resistance circles. The challenges both for him and for his students, most of whom now are drafted into the German military and fighting, become utterly different. So on the one level, he has a lot of insights into the challenges of living faithfully as a Christian in the modern world. And those challenges, I would say, are kind of universal in somewhat different in each country, of course. But if we read Bonhoeffer with the mindset that we're thinking about these things 100 years after he started his theology studies, that is, we're a century further into this dilemma. The world has changed that much more since he was teaching. But there are still larger challenges of what it means to try to be a faithful Christian in our own time, and then looking at the specific context of what, where we are today. But it's interesting how so much of what he wrote in the 1930s remains timeless. I mean, we're still focused on the importance of Christian fellowship and community, the importance of Christian practices, regular Bible reading, praying, scriptural study, all the things that we do to continue to reflect on our lives as Christians personally and in community. The deeper meaning of certain texts, and of course for him, one of those texts was the Sermon on the Mount, and the specific relevance that had for Christians even in the modern world. Reflections on the larger meaning of those things in terms of what it means to forgive, to repent, to think about how we behave ethically as Christians. And above all, I would say an emphasis on what I would describe as being conformed to Christ. What does it mean to be conformed to Christ, not to this world? What does it mean to live by a different set of teachings and values? And I think that his practices with his seminarians between 1935 and 39 really lay the foundation for a different way of thinking about these things after 1939, when he begins to confront an entirely different set of challenges. Because of the difference between that early period and the later period, this is a slide from last week. Many scholars sort of feel like there's a break in Bonhoeffer's life and work, that, from 35 to 39, he's focused on Christian discipleship, and he writes these books and he's teaching seminarians. After 1939, the war begins, he becomes drawn into the resistance. During that period, he writes two collections. One is his work on ethics. One are his prison letters once he's in prison. So these are very, if you've read these works, you'll know these are very different books. So there does seem to be sort of a break. Is the early Bonhoeffer more devout? Is the later Bonhoeffer more political? How do we make sense of this? Just one quick comment on these two wartime books. I don't know how many people have read them. Neither of them are written as books. That is, his Ethics, which has been published as a book, is not. He wanted to write a book on ethics, but what we have today is a cluster of manuscripts, fragments really, that he wrote during this period, and that his biographer after 1945 put together and turned into a book on ethics, but that it's not Bonhoeffer's completed book. These are still thoughts in process. In fact, if you have one of the old editions of Ethics and you compare it to the Bonhoeffer Works version, you would see that actually some of the things in those early in the early edition is no longer part of the later edition, because there was a German scholar who studied the kinds of paper that he wrote on, and realized, for example, that because of wartime restrictions, there are kinds of paper that existed in 1941 that no longer existed in 43, 44. That is, there's a wartime, much coarser grade paper that people use after the war really gets going. And so she was able to date these manuscripts. And so there are manuscripts that he actually writes in prison. And those manuscripts are now part of the other collections. So it shows that I guess my point is that we can't read this as a completed work. This is a series of reflections. So let me sort of go back to the central questions that were steering him both in his study and specifically in his teaching of seminarians. That question, so who is Christ for us today in the modern world? We're no longer, we can't be disciples of Jesus of Nazareth as he is living and walking the earth. But so what does that mean for us today? And where do we encounter Christ? What does it mean to be disciples of Christ? What does it mean to be the Church of Christ? And Bonhoeffer's conclusion is that being the church in the world means living essentially as the body of Christ in this world, witnessing to what he taught and encountering one another in that spirit. In the wartime years, he begins to think more concretely about what this means in the different spheres of our daily life, whether it's in our role in families, in our professional roles, whatever those might be, in our roles as citizens, as members of society, and in our faith community. And Bonhoeffer begins to think concretely about something that he actually calls ethics as formation. I think it's a fascinating title because it shows that he's still thinking in terms of that Christian formation, but what does it mean to act faithfully in times that are very different? And in his own context, of course, even up to 1939, the situation in Nazi Germany is very different from our own, is very different from, let's say, a normal society. But in his wartime context, he really begins to reflect more deeply on these questions. So this is a quotation from this little essay called Ethics as Formation, where he says, "Today we have villains and saints, Shakespeare's characters among us. These figures arise from primeval depths. is worse to be evil than to do evil. Evil appears in the form of light, of beneficence, of faithfulness, of renew. It appears in things that, we would think would be good. And that in itself is a clear confirmation of the profundity of this evilness. And he says the people who are trained to think in traditional terms, ethically, are utterly at a loss with what to do with this. They've got preconceived concepts of what it means to be a good person that don't address the situation that Christians in Nazi Germany are facing. So what does he mean by that? And let me just give you two short examples. First of all, I'm going to talk about the Nazi euthanasia program, because I think this really gets at the quotation that I've put on the screen here. The Nazi T4 program, the so-called euthanasia program, begins in the fall of 1939. It is a state-run, state-ordered program by which people who are living in institutions who have disabilities, physical or mental, are murdered. I mean, that's what the euthanasia program does. And what that means concretely is that the directors of these institutions, and many of them are run by either the Catholic or the Protestant Church, get a questionnaire from the state in the fall of 1939 asking for a roster of all their patients. And they fill out this form, they send it back. And then what literally happens is that the Gestapo shows up in front of an institution with a bus and orders the Gestapo has already made their own list of who should come out, and orders the director to send these patients out. They're put into the bus and they are taken, to the edge of town and killed by carbon monoxide. I mean, it is just an awful, brutal, dreadful situation, but this is literally how the early period of euthanasia is carried out. And word immediately begins to spread that this is what's going on. And so the directors of these institutions are now faced with awful decisions about how they should address this. And so you have cases of directors writing the families of patients and saying, please come and take your patient home. You have directors going through the list and scrambling to come up with reasons why some people, even if they're on the list, they shouldn't be taken. Maybe they're a war veteran, maybe they're, they come up with all kinds of reasons, but they're making life and death ethical decisions within the framework of a program that is absolutely evil. They shouldn't be making these kinds of choices. They shouldn't be called to make these choices. And so what does it mean in that context to behave ethically? And this is the kind of very concrete dilemma that Bonhoeffer begins to write about and reflect on in his manuscripts on ethics. And one of the most fascinating essays is a little essay called What Does It Mean to Tell the Truth? Bonhoeffer writes it in the fall of 1943, so he's in prison at this point. And he begins by saying, we know that we're supposed to tell the truth. We're not supposed to lie. This is, sort of a shared value. We're raised according to this principle. But what does that really mean? And he gives the example of a school teacher who calls a young child up to the front of the class and says, so is it true that your father comes home drunk every night? And the child says, no, it's not true. The teacher and the child both know that the child is lying, but Bonhoeffer says, what does it mean to tell a lie in that context? The teacher is clearly transgressing a line with this child, and the child is being summoned or called upon to betray his family. So understanding the truth is not as simple as following the commandment. And that's Bonhoeffer's point, that in this context in which normal standard social ethics have been turned upside down, an entirely different set of challenges confront us. And so his conclusions that he then elaborates on in his wartime writings is that we have free will, and so we take responsibility for what we do. And the usual constraints that we're used to following, we may transgress those, but we will have to answer for that. But we have to think in a more complex way about this. We're often called upon to act under circumstances in which there are no good options. I mean, think of the directors of these institutions. And therefore, we have to make an ethical judgment on our own capacity to act with the understandable understanding that we will have to answer for that. And ethics, Bonhoeffer therefore says, is often not just a matter of following a specific set of guidelines or rules, it's acting in free responsibility. And the historical context is so important for understanding what Bonhoeffer is trying to say, because as I mentioned, his central questions and what he begins to write about in his manuscripts on ethics is, we have standard expectations and rules. As parents, as professional, in our professional capacity as citizens, we know where the lines are. If you work for a business or a bank, you know that you're not supposed to steal money. If you're a parent or a teacher, you understand your responsibility for children. But in the new context, Bonhoeffer is saying, but what happens when all of this stuff is upended? And within an evil system, you're being asked to make judgment calls. And those are that's the perspective we need to understand as we look at his role in the resistance and some of the decisions he makes. So what does it mean then, confronted with these dilemmas, to act from the basis of Christian formation as Bonhoeffer taught it to his seminarians? And these are both quotes from the prison letters, but you can see, if you've been with me for the past couple of weeks, you can see how they draw upon much of which he taught his students. That being Christian doesn't mean being religious in a certain way, following a set of rules. It means being the kind of human being that Christ is creating in us. And that kind of human being is a human being that consciously shares in God's suffering, excuse me, in worldly life, in all the complexities with which we might be confronted on this earth. And then the second quote, this is how we learn how to have faith, is by acting or living in this worldliness, where we kind of give up the notion that, we call the shots, that we're going to be responsible for our lives, that we understand that we are always in the arms of God, that we are simply called upon as Christians to follow Christ, to take the consequences, to fail, to sin, but knowing that in doing this, we are standing with Christ at Gethsemane and we're throwing ourselves upon the mercy of God. My favorite quote from his essay on After 10 Years, which he also writes in 1943, and which builds on, there are excerpts from his essay on ethics as formation that find their way into this essay, where he says, this is what I believe God will do with our actions. And he says, God wants to let good come out of everything, even the greatest evil. For that to happen, God needs human beings to have faith. And he says, God will give us the strength we need. In such faith, we should not worry about the future. And then the sentence I absolutely love, I believe that even our mistakes and shortcomings are not in vain, and it's no more difficult for God to deal with them than with our supposedly good deeds. That is, we're acting as we follow Christ, not knowing how things are going to turn out. We may do something that we think is the right thing to do and only later realize that we have sinned. God takes care of that. God is no timeless fate, but will wait for our response. So this, I think, really illustrates that there is a continuity between what Bonhoeffer teaches his students and what he's thinking about during the wartime years. One of the most moving letters for me from the wartime years is from the first year of the war. He gets a letter from one of his students where, if you read between the lines, I think it's clear that this student is in a German army unit that is committing atrocities in Poland. That is mass murders of Jews, civilians, this kind of behavior. And the student is clearly looking for some guidance from Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer's reply to him is, remember that you are a Christian following Christ. It's not any more explicit than that. And the first time I read it, I was not happy with the answer. I thought, my goodness, what's Bonhoeffer doing there? As I've continued to think about this, I think it's building on this ethos that Bonhoeffer is hoping that whatever he has taught his students in the 1930s, they are able to carry with them, that their eye is on following Christ. and looking for the path of following Christ, which means sharing in the suffering of the world. And as he writes after 10 years, seeing the great events of world history from below, understanding that that Christ stood with the outcasts, the suspects, the people who were powerless, and that as Christians, that's where our place is well. And for him, this means, and he writes about this very clearly, that his church has failed. He looks at the German church under National Socialism and sees that it has fallen short in this witness. It has tried to sort of keep itself together under the pressures of the Nazi state, but in doing that, it has lost the path of discipleship. And so you do see in Bonhoeffer in the wartime years a disappointment with the church and a focus on that act of discipleship. So what does this mean for us? I think that the insights specifically that we get from his wartime and prison writings is this notion that in life we're called to make hard decisions and take responsibility, but that our guidance here is the context of faith and discipleship. There are places throughout his writings where he talks about Christianity not being a set of rules that you follow, not a set of principles. And it's not that the principles aren't there. I mean, we have the Sermon on the Mount, we have the 10 Commandments. But Bonhoeffer's point is that so often in life, we're called to make a decision where we don't have all the fine print, where we know what the 10 Commandments say, but the decision we're being called to make is much more complex, and we have to at that point then try to act out of compassion and a sense of discipleship to Christ. That is increasingly his criteria in the war. And it comes out of this affirmation and love for the world that he feels is embodied in the incarnation of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And what that means for us today is seeing the face of Christ in the neighbor who needs us and following Christ in healing the world and trying to do good, whatever demands are placed upon us. And in this context, of course, the sense that his church had failed and that Christianity itself, after Nazism was over, would need to sort of rethink some things based on its experience. And these, that last statement in particular comes from some of his prison letters and his writings on what he calls about religionless Christianity in a world come of age, which are fragmentary. We try to sort of glean what he means from that, but I think this is some of what he's talking about. So as we break into our groups, let me see how we're doing on time here. Are there any immediate questions or for clarifications? And what I'd like you to think about in your small groups today is, what does this mean for us today? Is there something here that I've talked about that especially resonates with you? But how does your own path of Christian formation, your own participation in a congregation, your own church life, how has that informed your personal life in whatever sphere, family, work, citizen, whatever? How has that helped inform how you think of what it means to be a Christian conformed to Christ? And is it helping you today? So let me leave the PowerPoint, and I see several questions. Okay, so a couple of quick questions. Can you provide the context for Bonhoeffer's statement, we're not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheel, drive a spoke into the wheel itself? Yeah, so this is a great question. It comes from his 1933 essay on the church and the Jewish question. So this is right at the beginning of the Nazi regime. And let me go back up here. And it comes in a series where he's going through, what should the church be called to do in light of the Nazi persecution of the Jews? And it's a 3-point answer. The first point is the church has to speak out for the victims of injustice, whether they are Christian or not. The second is that the church needs to help the victims, not just speak out, but reach out to assist them. And then this final statement, the church may be called not just to help the victims, but to stop the wheels from turning by driving a spoke into the wheel. The meaning of this is much debated among Bonhoeffer scholars. Is he already calling for resistance against the state, or is he, is he not that far? Because it's 1933, I would say he's not that far. There's no way that he can foresee where things are going to lead, but he's recognizing that the church is going to be called, I think, to step outside the normal boundaries and be a public presence in that situation where people are being, persecuted. So that's kind of a all too short answer. We could spend a whole session on this, but that's the context. Which version of the Sermon on the Mount? So Bonhoeffer used the Luther Bible in German. I'm trying to think of what the American translation that is closest to the Lutheran Bible is, but it's Matthew. I mean, it's the Matthew text. Where the Lutheran Church fell during this time, not a confessing church, but part of the state. So yes, the church of which Bonhoeffer was a member, the German Evangelical Church, was a state church in that people supported it by paying taxes to the state. Those taxes supported the church. It understood itself historically as a pillar of the state. German pastors were civil servants. The confessing church arose within that Lutheran church against the pro-Nazi faction in that Lutheran church. All of them stayed within the church. So there wasn't ever a completely separate confessing church. This is a battle going on within one tradition and one institution. Forgiveness of atrocities. What does forgiveness mean today? Oh my goodness. 5-week series on forgiveness. This is such a big question. We are called as Christians to forgive, and I think it's interesting. Bonhoeffer doesn't write that much about this. I'll say that off the top. And this is something where I think we really noticed the absence of Bonhoeffer after 1945. It would have been interesting to see what he would have had to say after the defeat of National Socialism. I think, but Bonhoeffer's take, if you read between the lines of his ethics, is clear that we encounter each other, as children of God, as creatures in which we see the face of Christ. That doesn't mean that we don't judge. That doesn't mean that everything's a wash. But that we understand that ultimately the judgment and forgiveness is going to rest with a higher power, with God. And so that would be my short answer. So the summary of this is to be born again according to Christ's demands. I would agree with that. I mean, I think that's what Bonhoeffer is writing about in discipleship, but it's a process. It's not a one-time thing. You don't, join a church, confess to Christ, be baptized, and say, so now, I'm a Christian. The Christianity is living out your life with all of the demands and all the complexities of this earthly life. In that act of discipleship, parallels between the way of the church in Germany and conservative churches. I think there are parallels. I mean, I would say there are differences between the American church landscape and the German church landscape. But that, Bonhoeffer writes a wonderful essay, and I wish I had another session to go into this in 1939, called Christianity, Protestantism Without Reformation.
I can guarantee you that you'll have another opportunity.
Anyway, this essay is it's a direct comparison between the German churches and the American churches in 1939. And of course, by 1939, Bonhoeffer has a very sober view of the failings of his church. But one of the interesting comments he makes in his take on the American church landscape is twofold. One is that he says, the American churches have never had a reformation because they all came at different times. They've got very different theologies. They've got very different takes. They've got different polities. They've got different confessions. He said, you can't have a reformation when you don't have a single tradition, which is what you have in the German church. So in America, you've got mainline churches and evangelicals and Pentecostals and, fast forwarding to our day, interdenominational churches and, one denominational church. And so you've got a mix that in terms of its theology and practice and creedal structure, if you will, is not as clear as the German church. And Bonhoeffer says for that reason in the United States, what happens is that all these different religious groups, and here he's talking not just about Christians, but every group, the sphere in which they contest these issues is the public sphere, and it tends to be the political sphere. And this is where Bonhoeffer's insight kind of builds on his insights in 1931, but he understands much better now what that means in terms of what it means when a church is defining its public discipleship purely in political terms, by its political stands. And he sees that that's the danger of the American church. And he has a fascinating quote where he says, Americans understand the freedom of the church very differently than Jesus intended it to be. And the freedom of the church doesn't mean that you've got political power. He says a church that follows that route is going to be secularized, and that's the word he used, secularized much quicker than a church that doesn't, because you're now judging your faith purely by worldly and political terms. So I've just opened up a whole can of worms, but it's interesting. It's an interesting essay in that it shows his changes in thinking over the course of the 30s. And I think he's got some interesting insights into the complexities of the United States. So I'm going to stop there because I want time for breakout groups. Maybe you can continue to discuss all this in your breakout groups. We'll come back in about 15 minutes or about 12 minutes. And think about concretely what you've gotten out of the past 5 weeks and what you get out of your own participation in your respective churches in terms of informing your life as a Christian in this world. So let me go here, and I'll see you in about 12 minutes. Okay, see you soon. Just join, you'll get an invitation, just join the group that invites you. So if you're seeing an invitation, please do join. I can't tell if some people are not seeing invitations. If I see you on my screen, let me know what, you can type something into the, I think there's a way for me to put you into a group if you need me to do that. Just let me know. So the people, I'm seeing 6 faces on my screen. Do you need me to move you to a group? Would you like me to? Just let me know, raise your hand. Maybe this is my group. So you will need to unmute yourself if you want to bring something up within our group, if you have questions. Or if you're taking a coffee break, that's fine too. Missy, Daniel, I see your face. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I did. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Can I talk to you?
I'm sorry?
Can I talk to you, or?
Yes, of course. Of course, yeah.
I just was thinking about intercessory prayer.
Yeah.
And the prayer, it seems to me in this prison period, he concludes that it's the most important form of prayer, in that we should be so thinking about the other, that we're interceding for the other, is so important in our prayers during this time. Is that legit? Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know if he would say it's the most important, but it's crucial. And he really emphasizes that in the 1930s as well. That he's constantly telling his, the Finkenwalder seminarians, Every letter he sends out, they're supposed to be praying for each other. And that in itself also is a kind of a way of deepening one's own spiritual life. If you think of yourself in your own life as connected to people, and think of how you can help them, what their needs are. I think that's important. It's hard. I can't tell with the, I'm not seeing other faces. I'm just seeing names here. So I don't know if they want to speak up. If anyone wants to speak up, feel free to unmute yourself.
Can I ask you about
Yes,
another?
yeah,
This follows on a bit, but it sounds like during this time in prison, he experienced the bombing raids very intensely.
Yeah.
And there's one story where this has been, all the windows of the prison are blown out and the infirmary is destroyed. And here you have these prisoners thrown on top of each other, kind of scared to death and trying to, yet he says he didn't want to use that moment to try to persuade anybody about Christianity or God or CEU. He just didn't want to use it that way. And so I wondered if this is also the beginning of his kind of thinking about what the church should be in the future. It shouldn't be about just, I don't know, trying to convert, I don't know, his conversion idea or how to convert, but so I was interested in that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful insight. I think it's connected to that. I would say that his understanding of his emphasis on the church, and this, comes in 44 and 45.
Right.
Excuse me. Really understanding its worldly role very differently as a path of discipleship, not an institution that's trying to grow its numbers. And that he's practicing that, of course, in the middle of a bombing raid. You're not going to be proselytizing anyway.
Right.
But that he's thinking of. I think he's looking at this issue of tending to other people and helping them, rather than trying to say, "Here I am, the Christian is lunch."
Right.
Although it's sort of interesting. There's one account, not in that specific. I don't think it's in that letter, but where there's someone in the prison who is just a very outspoken anti-Semitic Nazi, and Bonhoeffer talks about struggling with whether he doesn't even want to be nice to him. He just that he has this antipathy. So struggling with those kinds of issues.
And is it fair to say, despite how fragmentary it is as he begins to envision what the church might be after the war, it seems to me that the traditional rites and rituals of the church, the creeds, the sacraments, will all be kind of hidden. And the identity of the church will be this engagement with the world. It won't be these other things.
So I don't think that's what he means by this. I think you're talking about his writings on this sort of arcane discipline, the traditional, the old practices. He does talk about the churches. I think his idea is that it won't be there as the cultural institution that it was during his lifetime, and that it still is in many places. But that it's, these traditional practices of communion and confession are crucially important for people in this community to maintain, because this is kind of the glue that helps knit them together.
Right.
You know.
Right. Okay.
but you're right that he also does say, this is in the 1944 letter to his namesake on the day of his baptism,
Yes.
where he's thinking about the future of the church. And he says,
Yes.
the church is going to be very different when you grow up. And it will, will have a much more hidden agenda. And I think it's also an acknowledgement that in the modern world, the church doesn't have the place it did. And that's one of the things, in fact, that, they're struggling with in Bonhoeffer's time.
And is it fair to characterize him after you read all these things? I mean, he seems like a very hard-headed guy. And I wonder what else you have gleaned about his person.
That is such a fascinating question. I'm still trying to figure this one out. It's something I'm working on right now. When I finished translating, or when I finished the new edition of the Big Beta biography, I remember saying to somebody, I still don't know who this guy was. I mean, you don't get glimpses of the personality. And it's interesting because I just translated this big biography on Karl Barth, and you do get a sense of who Barth was as a person. One of the interesting things, though, because I've been going back through accounts, by all the accounts I can find, by people who knew him, of what he was like. And one of the interesting things is that you get very different takes on him at different points in his lifetime.
Yeah.
And one of the more striking set of accounts is there are a fair number of people who talk about, how he had this charismatic, almost radiant personality as a child and a young man that then kind of disappears. And I wonder, he talks about his struggles with depression, and I wonder if some of that can be traced to depression. But also perhaps the circumstances of the 1930s. The only account I found that talks about him having a sense of humor is Paul Lehmann's, from the year that he was a student at Union in the early 1930s, where Lehmann says he was actually a very funny guy. Nobody else says that. And certainly reading his letters, you don't get the impression of, you have this impression of this very serious, intense, highly demanding person.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's an interesting observation. Like I said, I'm still trying to what I'm going to end up with are these very different and somewhat disparate accounts of who he was.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing to even get those glimpses of wit.
Yeah.
Even when he was in this dire circumstances, like Bart sends him a cigar.
Right.
And I mean, he sees sort of some humor there, I think.
Yeah, he enjoys that. I mean, you do get senses of his enjoyment of life. I mean, you do get that. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing is just whatever the church is going to be in the future, his ideas, his theology, his life of prayer and all is completely rooted in music and hymns and the Lutheran chorales, and just every reference is to the footnotes are full of that in the book. This is connected to this hymn and that hymn, and so he doesn't lose it.
It was really important to him. I think I'm going to have to bring people back. Well, let me see. Yeah, let me sort of send out the message.
Okay, sorry.
So everyone's getting 60 seconds to come back.
Do you have a cold? Are you okay?
I'm okay. I have allergies. So whatever the time of year, I always have like a certain level of sniffles. And this morning, I think it's because of the rain. It's
okay.
Okay. To write more books. Let me see. Let me answer that. Yeah, I can. Welcome back. So I want to make the best use of our time. If people have questions or comments from your groups that you'd like to bring out into the discussion, I'm sure everyone would be grateful to hear about them.
Well, thanks to Steve Denny, we talked about complicity in our group and it was very compelling. So maybe Steve has more to say, but I really enjoyed that aspect.
Any other comments on complicity or from Steve? I don't see where this is. Or if
Here
you
I
want
am.
Okay.
So yeah, just we talked about complicity and forgiveness, but I was sharing that the being part of a faith community and the breadth of formation activities as sort of outlined by Bonhoeffer helps me be more aware and be willing to take a stand based on my Christian values and the support of my faith community.
Yeah. Let me sort of open up the chat because there are questions coming in here. As you think about your questions, so we talked about Bonhoeffer's response to the soldier. It seemed he didn't help him, or did he, by pointing him back to Christ's teachings? So that was kind of my question and something I struggled with. And it's, this is one of those situations where all we have are the documents and you're sort of reading between the lines. So, the first observation is that, soldiers were actually forbidden from talking about atrocities back home. They could be punished if they did that. And Bonhoeffer would certainly have put both of them at risk. And there was censorship of military letters. And so Bonhoeffer would have put them both at risk from both directions, if the soldier had talked more explicitly about what was going on, and if Bonhoeffer had written back and said, I gather this is what's going on, you need to do this or that. And so, it's that, so yeah, that's the big question. This is a young man who had studied with him in Finkenwalde, studied for the ministry. And when Bonhoeffer writes back and says, you keep in mind who you truly serve, you are a disciple of Christ. Yeah. If that's enough, if that's giving the soldier the message that he needs. But it's one of those big questions that comes out of this period. How's Bonhoeffer regarded in Germany today? So I feel that Bonhoeffer has always had a very differently and more extensive following in the English-speaking world, especially in the United States, but that over the years than he has in Germany. But there is certainly, Bonhoeffer certainly read. There are lots of streets and schools named after him. I guess, one of my questions, and I don't know the answer to this, is whether this is now far enough back in history that for younger generations coming up today, Bonhoeffer has the same significance that he did, let's say, for Germans in the 60s and 70s. Does the generational difference make a difference in how they understand him, especially in these questions of Christian formation in the church? The German church population is dwindling. Many of the younger generation don't belong to the church. That's increasingly true in the United States as well. Younger people are not joining the church. So what does Bonhoeffer mean, in terms of his Christian teachings, and can we really understand him without that? So there are lots of questions I think that come up about, whether people reading Bonhoeffer today can even understand him if they're not coming out of that, either that cultural tradition or the Christian tradition. Our group saw similarities of Bonhoeffer's thoughts applicable today. There are many, this question of what does it mean to be a Christian in the world is always there. It was there a century ago, it was there 2 centuries ago, and each age, each era has its own particular set of challenges. So, the challenges that Christians face in Nazi Germany are, I would say, in many ways different from those today, in some ways similar. And so these are, this reading Bonhoeffer is not like reading, a blueprint for how you should act. I feel like he raises the right questions and points us in a useful direction for trying to discern what God's will is for us today. To understand more of Bonhoeffer is to keep studying God's word. Yes, I would agree with that. I mean, that's what Bonhoeffer himself was doing until the end of his life.
Victoria, a question going back on to the applicable to today's church community.
Yeah.
Is there ever a sense that Bonhoeffer was looking in past history and making the same comparisons that we're doing today? I mean, he was looking at past histories and trying to warn people this has happened prior.
Not in the sense that he's, that's a really interesting question. I don't think so directly. I mean, what he talks about is the timelessness of the dilemma. And he does talk about the changes in the understanding of Christianity and therefore the self-understanding of Christians, where he says, in Luther's time, there was a different relationship to the church and to God's word. Today we live in this world come of age, and that makes it much more difficult and to discern God's will and to find and it makes it very difficult to find a language that speaks to today's world that conveys what God wills for us. But I'm not thinking of things directly in his text where he says, this happened in our history and this is what we need to think about today. Other questions or comments? We've got about 5 minutes. Okay, another question in the chat. Do I think of him as more of an individualist or a group type of Christian? Oh, wow, that is such a great question. He was a member teaching a group, and yet groups in the church and the state failed him. Yeah, this is a wonderful question. In the breakout group that I was part of, one of the questions that came up was, what was Bonhoeffer like in terms of his personality? And it's such a difficult question to answer. He's not transparent in his writings. And people who knew him at different points in his life have very different descriptions of him. He does seem to have been a loner in a sense, and he felt a sense of isolation. Abraham Bethke once said that he became a theologian because he was a lonely person, and his theology reflects that. So there is something to that, and yet he places such emphasis on the nature of community and the importance of community, and he even writes in his dissertation that you can't be a Christian by yourself. You have to be part of a community, because being a Christian means being with the other and living for others. So he's teaching that, and yet by nature, it's a good question in terms of him. I don't know if individualist is the right word for it, but there is this sense that he's kind of out there, and of course he never really fits in with his church. What's my view of the rise of Christian nationalism in our country? So this is something, I'm actually part of a panel this coming Friday that's kind of looking, where I'm supposed to bring the German history into the conversation. I'm sorry?
We were asking if you could hear the lecture somehow. That's so pertinent.
Yeah, unfortunately, the workshop I'm in is private. So this is at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, and it's kind of a half-day program, and there is a public panel, but it's just 2 of the speakers, and I'm not going to be one of them. So if you go to the Berkeley Center and look at their Friday program from 1 o'clock, that's what this is. But in the morning, I'll be discussing it. And as I've been thinking about this, so yes, I think that Christian nationalism looks the same. I mean, in many respects, whether you're looking at it today and in 30s Germany, and in other contexts, that there are certain features that sort of show the dangers. I mean, one of the interesting things I'm going to bring up on Friday is that I found a quote by a British observer in the 19th century who goes to Germany and comes back and writes that their sense of nationalism is so strong that for most Christians in Germany, they don't know where the Christianity stops and the nationalism begins. And he's saying this in 1885. So, that sense of, in which, our sense of national identity informs and shapes our faith is one of the things that Bonhoeffer is really trying to pull his seminarians out of by sending them back to the scripture and to Christian community and saying, we live in this world as citizens of our countries, but we live for Christ, and that's a very different demand. Excuse me. There's another question in between there?
Last chance.
This is James.
Okay.
I think in today's time, Bonhoeffer is once again ever more relevant to us in the United States, as we have engaged and accepted such deep divisions, such often negative characterizations of people by culture, by race. It's a very, very challenging time. And the fear of the white community becoming maybe a minority community, and then the effort to counter that is just a very dangerous time, and Bonhoeffer's extremely relevant.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, his insights into what it means to live as a Christian in the world are, I think, as applicable today as they are back in the 30s. And that in itself is kind of interesting, that he manages to really sort of look at these challenges and discern a much bigger message from them. So I'm looking at one final comment. Christian nationalism is made up of fake Christians. I would like to confirm that, but I mean, this is one of the things that comes up when you talk about the churches in Nazi Germany and look at these pro-Nazi Christians and say they're not real Christians. From my vantage point, yes, that would be true. But from their vantage point, they read the Bible, they follow their devotions, they understand themselves as Christian. I mean, so it's a complicated question. It really is. I mean, it's not enough to sort of say, look, those aren't the real Christians, because when you're dealing with them representing Christianity in society, then you've got to deal with the questions that come out of that. And that, I guess that's my closing statement. It's 10:30.
I want to thank you, Dr. Barnett, from all of us. I know you welcome questions after this class ends. And if you have questions and you don't have her contact information, please email me. And I want to thank Becca Messman and Trinity Church for making this a much more sort of vibrant community with 2 churches participating. Thank you, Becca, and all the people from Trinity for being here. And we, as I hope, will have Dr. Barnett back at some time in the future. And thank you so much for your wisdom, your scholarship, and for being with us.
Well, thank all of you, and blessings on your own lives and your time ahead and your time in your congregations. I'm glad to have been with you.